On August 13th, 1977, Elvis received a letter that made him lock himself in his bedroom for hours, crying. 3 days later, he was dead, and that letter was still in his hand. What it said destroyed him. The letter arrived at Graceland on a Saturday afternoon, mixed in with hundreds of other pieces of fan mail that came every single day. Elvis received so much mail that he had 3 assistants, whose only job was to sort through it, categorize it, and occasionally bring important pieces to his attention. Most of the mail never reached Elvis himself. Birthday cards, concert requests, marriage proposals, the usual flood of adoration that came with being the most famous entertainer in the world. But this letter was different, not because of how it looked. It was written on plain notebook paper in shaky handwriting, but because of what it said and when it arrived. The envelope was addressed simply, "To Elvis Presley, from the Wilson family." Inside was a single page, and the words written there would haunt Elvis for the last 72 hours of his life. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Presley, our daughter Sarah died on August 2nd, 1977. She was 9 years old. She had leukemia. 6 months ago, we wrote to you asking if she could meet you or come to one of your concerts. We never heard back. Sarah waited every day for a response. She told us you would answer. She believed in you until her last breath. We buried her yesterday wearing her Elvis t-shirt. We thought you should know that she died waiting for you. Sincerely, the Wilson family." When Elvis read those words, something inside him shattered completely. He locked himself in his bedroom and didn't come out for 6 hours. His girlfriend Ginger Alden could hear him crying through the door. His staff stood outside, worried but afraid to interrupt. This wasn't the first time Elvis had isolated himself. He'd been struggling with depression, addiction, and the crushing weight of his declining health for years. But there was something different about this breakdown. What nobody in that hallway knew, what Elvis himself had only just remembered with horrifying clarity, was that he had received the Wilson family's original letter 6 months earlier. And he had made a promise he'd completely forgotten. It was February 1977. Elvis was preparing for another grueling tour, his body already breaking down from years of prescription drug abuse and the relentless pace his manager, Colonel Parker, demanded. He was exhausted, overweight, and increasingly disconnected from the world around him. But on one particular afternoon, his assistant Joe Esposito had brought him a stack of urgent fan mail, letters that required responses or special attention. Among them was a letter from Margaret Wilson of Jackson, Mississippi. The letter explained that her 9-year-old daughter Sarah had been diagnosed with terminal leukemia. The doctors had given her less than a year to live. Sarah's only wish was to see Elvis Presley perform, or better yet, to meet him in person. The family couldn't afford concert tickets, and Sarah was too weak to travel far. They were writing to ask if there was any way, any possibility at all, that their daughter could meet her hero before she died. Elvis had been moved by the letter. Despite everything else falling apart in his life, he'd always had a soft spot for sick children. He'd granted wishes for kids before, brought them backstage, sent them gifts. It was one of the few things that still made him feel like his fame meant something. He'd dictated a response to Joe. "Tell them yes. Tell them when I do the Memphis concert in August, I'll arrange everything. Front row seats, backstage passes, the whole thing. Tell them Sarah will meet me, and we'll make it a day she'll never forget." Joe had written down the instructions and promised to handle it. But Joe Esposito was managing a dying man's chaotic schedule, fielding hundreds of requests a week and trying to keep Elvis functional enough to perform. In the chaos of tour preparations, prescriptions, and Colonel Parker's relentless demands, the Wilson family letter got filed away and forgotten. No response was ever sent. February became March, March became April. Elvis went on tour, came home, went on tour again. His health continued to deteriorate. He canceled shows, struggled through performances, spent days in bed unable to move. The pain was constant now, physical and emotional. He was a 42-year-old man who looked 60, trapped in a body and a life he no longer recognized. Back in Jackson, Mississippi, Sarah Wilson was fighting her own battle. The leukemia was aggressive and unforgiving. She went through rounds of chemotherapy that left her weak and sick, losing her hair, losing weight, losing hope. But she had one thing that kept her going. Elvis was going to respond. He was going to bring her to his concert. He was going to meet her. "He'll write back, Mama," Sarah would say every time her mother checked the mail. "Elvis wouldn't forget about me." Margaret Wilson didn't have the heart to tell her daughter the truth, that famous people probably didn't read their fan mail, that they'd likely never hear back, that Elvis Presley had no idea Sarah Wilson existed. So she let her daughter believe. She let that hope keep Sarah alive through the painful treatments, through the bad days, through the moments when giving up seemed easier than fighting. As spring turned to summer, Sarah's condition worsened. The cancer was winning. The doctors told the Wilson family to prepare for the end. It could be weeks now, maybe days. Sarah was in and out of the hospital, spending more time unconscious than awake. But whenever she was conscious, she asked the same question. "Did Elvis write back yet?" "Not yet, baby," Margaret would say, her heart breaking. "But I'm sure he will soon." On August 1st, 1977, Sarah Wilson slipped into a coma. The doctor said it was only a matter of time now. The family gathered at the hospital, knowing these were likely her final hours. Sarah died the next morning, August 2nd, at 6:47 a.m., without ever waking up. She was 9 years old. She'd been waiting for Elvis's response for 6 months. It never came. Margaret Wilson was destroyed. She'd lost her only daughter to a disease that showed no mercy. But mixed with her grief was something else. Anger. Anger at a man who could have given her daughter one moment of joy in her final months, but had ignored her instead. A week after the funeral, still consumed by grief and rage, Margaret sat down and wrote the letter that would arrive at Graceland on August 13th. She wrote every word with tears streaming down her face, every sentence infused with the pain of a mother who'd watched her child die, waiting for a promise that never came. She mailed it not expecting a response, not hoping for anything except to make Elvis Presley know that his silence had hurt a little girl who'd believed in him until her last breath. When Elvis read that letter on August 13th, the memories came flooding back with devastating clarity. He remembered the original letter. He remembered dictating the response. He remembered saying, "Tell them yes." And he remembered, oh God, he remembered, that he'd never followed up, never asked Joe if it had been handled, never thought about it again. Sarah Wilson had died, waiting for him. A 9-year-old girl who'd believed he would keep his promise had spent her last months checking the mail, asking her mother if Elvis had written back, holding on to hope that he would save her from despair, even if he couldn't save her from death. And Elvis had forgotten about her. Completely, utterly forgotten. The guilt was unbearable. Elvis sat in his bedroom, reading and rereading the letter, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what his negligence had cost. This wasn't a missed autograph or a declined photo. This was a dying child who'd spent her final months waiting for him. This was a promise he'd made and broken through simple, catastrophic forgetfulness. He wanted to call the family, to apologize, to explain. But what could he possibly say? "I'm sorry I forgot your dying daughter existed. I'm sorry my assistant didn't follow through. I'm sorry I was too drugged and distracted to remember the promise I made." There were no words that could make this right. Nothing he could do now would change the fact that Sarah Wilson had died, believing Elvis didn't care about her. Over the next 3 days, Elvis spiraled deeper into despair. He barely ate. He barely slept. He took more pills than usual, trying to numb the pain, trying to escape the guilt, trying to quiet the voice in his head that kept repeating, "You let her die waiting for you." Ginger Alden tried to comfort him, but Elvis was unreachable. He kept the letter on his nightstand, picking it up and reading it obsessively. Sometimes he'd just sit there holding it, crying silently. Other times he'd talk to it, apologizing to Sarah as if she could somehow hear him from beyond the grave. "I'm sorry, baby," he'd whisper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't forget you on purpose. I didn't mean to break my promise." But apologies to the air didn't change anything. Sarah was still dead. The promise was still broken. And Elvis was still the man who'd failed her. On the morning of August 16th, 1977, Elvis was found dead in his bathroom at Graceland. The official cause was cardiac arrhythmia, brought on by years of prescription drug abuse and deteriorating health. He was 42 years old. when the staff entered his bedroom to begin the terrible process of notifying family and preparing for the chaos that would follow, they found the letter from Margaret Wilson still sitting on Elvis's nightstand. Next to it was a pen and a blank piece of paper, as if Elvis had been trying to write a response but couldn't find the words. The letter was carefully folded and unfolded so many times in those 72 hours that the creases had started to tear. There were tear stains on the paper, watermarks that blurred some of the words. Elvis had read it dozens of times, maybe hundreds in his final 3 days. Years later, Joe Esposito would admit in an interview that he'd found the original Wilson family letter from February still in Elvis's office filing system, marked pending response, but never acted upon. The guilt Joe felt was immense, but nothing compared to what Elvis must have felt when he realized what his organizational chaos had cost. "If I had just followed through," Joe said, tears in his eyes decades after the fact, "that little girl could have met Elvis. She could have died happy. And maybe Elvis wouldn't have spent his last days in such agony. The guilt of that broken promise. I think it was the final thing that broke him completely." Margaret Wilson received notification of Elvis's death the same way millions of others did, through news reports. For a brief moment she felt a flash of grim satisfaction. He was dead too now. He knew what it felt like to leave things unfinished, to have no more time left. But then she read the tributes, the stories from other families whose children Elvis had helped, the accounts of the hundreds of wishes he'd granted over the years. She learned that he'd sent hospital bills for sick kids, paid for surgeries, brought joy to dying children. She realized that her letter, the one she'd written in anger and grief, might have been one of the last things Elvis read before he died. Years later, when the grief had softened enough for her to think clearly, Margaret Wilson gave an interview to a local Mississippi paper. She said she regretted sending that letter. She said she'd written it in pain, wanting to hurt him the way she'd been hurt, not realizing that Elvis had probably made her daughter a promise in good faith and that the failure was bureaucratic, not intentional. "I wanted him to feel guilty," she admitted, and apparently he did. "I wanted him to know that Sarah died waiting for him. And he knew. For his last 3 days, he knew. I thought it would make me feel better, knowing he suffered for what he'd done to Sarah. But it didn't. It just meant 2 people died with broken hearts instead of 1. The letter from Margaret Wilson was eventually returned to her family after Elvis's estate was settled. She kept it in a box with Sarah's belongings, the Elvis records Sarah loved, the T-shirt she'd been buried in, the pictures of her daughter smiling despite the pain. But she never displayed it. She never framed it or showed it to people. It was a reminder of the worst moments of 2 lives, Sarah's death and Elvis's final days. It was proof that sometimes broken promises don't just hurt the people waiting for them to be kept. Sometimes they destroy the people who made them. Today, there's a footnote in some Elvis biographies about the letter found on his nightstand when he died. Most books don't identify the family or give details out of respect for their privacy, but those who knew about it say that letter represented something Elvis struggled with his entire final year, the growing realization that fame and success meant nothing if you failed the people who believed in you most. Elvis had given everything to his career. He'd sacrificed his health, his marriage, his privacy, his peace of mind. He'd performed when he could barely stand, signed autographs when he could barely hold a pen, smiled for cameras when he was dying inside. He'd made Colonel Parker rich, made RCA Records billions, made Las Vegas fortunes. He'd changed music, influenced generations, became a legend. But he'd forgotten one 9-year-old girl named Sarah Wilson. And in his final 72 hours, that seemed to be the only thing that mattered. The promise he couldn't keep became the weight he couldn't carry. And when they found him on that bathroom floor, the letter was still there on the nightstand, a silent witness to the guilt that may have contributed to his final moments. Some promises, once broken, can never be fixed. Some regrets, once realized, can never be escaped. And sometimes, the things we forget to do haunt us more than the things we choose not to do. Elvis Presley died with thousands of promises kept and 1 promise broken. But that 1 promise, the one that mattered most to a dying little girl who believed in him, was the one that destroyed him in the end. If this story about promises, guilt, and the weight of unfinished business moved you, please share this video. Hit that subscribe button to support more honest stories about the humanity behind the legends. Have you ever broken a promise you couldn't fix? Let us know in the comments. And remember, sometimes the smallest promises matter the most.